I made the sign of the cross in the middle of hell on earth, and the Lord carried me back after that terrible battle. In the years that followed, they would say it was one of the most disastrous fights we ever faced in Vietnam. I do not argue with them. I was there. I walked out alive while so many of my brothers never left that hillside. When you survive something like that, you start to wonder why. Why him and not me? Why did I make it home while men stronger, braver, maybe even better than me, were left behind under the red soil of the Central Highlands? I do not have an answer. The only thing I know is that in the middle of that madness, when bullets snapped through the air and the ground shook under mortars, I touched my chest, made that old Catholic sign and whispered a prayer. Somehow I am still here. The memory does not fade. Comes back in pieces and flashes. The chop of helicopter blades in the foggy morning. The endless rain dripping through 3 layers of jungle canopy. The metallic stench of blood mixed with the bitter smoke of gunpowder. The scream of a wounded man calling for his mother, echoing through the trees. These are not things you forget. They come to you at night, when the house is quiet, when the world is safe, and suddenly you are 20 years old again, crawling through mud, clutching your rifle like it is the only thing tying you to life. Vietnam was a beautiful country. That is the part no one really understands. The mountains, the rivers, the dense jungle alive with birds and insects. Sometimes when the sun broke through the mist, it looked almost like paradise. And then the shooting would start and paradise turned into hell in an instant. That was the cruel trick of that place. You could be staring at the most beautiful green valley you had ever seen, and the next second it was filled with fire and death. In 1967 we were young, most of us barely out of high school. We carried 100 pounds of gear on our backs, trudging through mud up to our knees, with leeches on our legs and sweat burning our eyes. We joked, we smoked cigarettes when we could, we wrote letters home. We thought we were tough. But nothing in training prepared us for what we faced in those mountains. I remember the way the jungle swallowed sound. You could only see a few yards ahead and everything was a blur of green and shadow. You knew the enemy was out there, but you almost never saw them until they opened fire. They were ghosts, slipping through the trees, vanishing into tunnels and bunkers they had spent months digging. Every step we took felt like walking into an ambush. Sometimes it was. The first time I saw a buddy fall, it was like the world stopped. He was right next to me and then he wasn't. One moment he was breathing, sweating, cursing the mud like the rest of us. The next moment his body crumpled into the ferns, his helmet rolling away, the life gone from his eyes. I froze. My throat went dry. I could not even raise my rifle. That was when I understood. This war was not just something you read about in the Stars and Stripes newspaper. It was real. It was death at arm's length. We had come to the Central Highlands because our commanders believed the North Vietnamese were moving in heavy forces from Cambodia and Laos. They were right. Intelligence reports spoke of regiments massing in the hills, waiting for us. Our job was to stop them, to cut their supply lines, to deny them control of the region. But if you ask me, it felt less like we were hunting them and more like they were hunting us. I want you to understand something before we go any further. What I am about to tell you is not a history lesson. I am no general, no historian. I am just a soldier who was there. I carried a rifle, I dug foxholes, I watched my friends die. These are not dates and numbers on a page. These are memories carved into my skin and my heart. Some of them still hurt to speak about. But I feel like I owe it to the men who did not come home. I owe it to tell their story even if my voice shakes. And so I will take you back with me to that November in 1967, when the Battle of Dak to turn those hills into killing fields. It was the place where courage met despair, where faith clashed with fear, and where we learned the price of war in the most brutal way imaginable. And so, after the prayers and the doubts, after the realization that we were walking straight into hell, we began our march into the Central Highlands. It was not a dramatic beginning. No music, no speeches. Just the heavy sound of boots sinking into mud and the endless hiss of rain falling through the canopy above. We were young men carrying not only rifles, but the weight of a war that none of us truly understood. Each of us bore nearly 100 pounds on our backs. The rucksack alone was a monster. Spare uniforms, ammunition, grenades, canteens, rations, claymore mines, sometimes even parts of mortar tubes. The radio operators had it worst, their packs bulging with PRC-25 radios and spare batteries that felt like bricks. By the time you slung your M16 across your chest and checked the bandoliers of ammo, you felt like a mule rather than a man. The weight wasn't just on our backs. It was pressing on our souls. And then there was the rain. In Vietnam, the rain did not fall politely. It slammed down hour after hour until everything we owned was soaked through. Our fatigues clung to our skin, heavy and clammy. Boots filled with water. Socks never dried. The ground beneath us turned to a sucking swamp, every step pulling us downward. We marched in lines, heads down, the rain dripping from our helmets, trickling into our eyes. It felt as though the sky itself was against us. At night, when we tried to rest, there was no comfort. The jungle floor was never dry, never warm. You would sit against a tree, shivering in wet clothes, listening to the constant drone of insects. Your breath fogged in the damp air, mixing with the mist that hung like a veil over the mountains. Even in sleep, if you managed to close your eyes, the rain would find you, seeping into your dreams. But the rain was not our only enemy. The jungle itself seemed alive, and it was determined to break us. Leeches were everywhere. You could feel them squirming into your boots, sucking at your ankles, crawling under your shirt. You would slice them off with a knife, only to find more the next day. Mosquitoes hummed in clouds, leaving welts that swelled until you scratched them raw. Malaria was a constant fear, and the pills they gave us tasted like chalk and never seemed to work. I remember one night, a buddy of mine woke up screaming. A leech had crawled into his nose while he slept, and we had to hold him down while another guy burned it out with a cigarette. The smell of burning flesh and the muffled cries of a grown man in the dark, those are the kinds of things that stay with you. We were fighting the jungle as much as the enemy. And yet, even in that misery, there were moments of humanity. I can still see us huddled under ponchos during a downpour, passing around a single cigarette like it was gold. One drag each, the orange glow lighting up tired faces. Somebody would whisper a joke, and for a moment the whole squad would chuckle softly, like kids trying not to wake their parents. In those seconds, the war felt far away. Sometimes we told stories. One guy from Alabama used to talk about his daddy's farm, how the cornfield stretched all the way to the horizon. Another guy carried a photo of his high school sweetheart folded into his helmet band. He would take it out at night, staring at it like it was a map back home. I remember a 19-year-old kid from New York who confessed he had never even kissed a girl. We laughed, not to mock him, but because it reminded us how young we all were. The bond between us was forged in mud and misery. You could not survive that place alone. You needed the guy next to you, the one sharing his canteen when yours was empty, the one pulling leeches off your legs, the one whispering that you would both see home again someday. That brotherhood was the only comfort we had. Still, the thoughts of home never left us. Letters arrived, stained with rain and sweat, and we read them until the paper nearly fell apart. Some of us wrote back every chance we got, pouring our hearts onto the page, though we never said the one thing we wanted most, that we were scared and that we wanted to come home. Superstition held us back. To admit it felt like asking for death. I used to close my eyes and picture my mother's kitchen, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of a baseball game on the radio. For a moment I could almost believe I was back there. Then the rain would drip onto my face or a mosquito would bite and reality came crashing back. We were thousands of miles from home, in a place that seemed determined to erase us. The jungle tested us every step of the way. But worse than the leeches, the rain, and the endless wait, was the knowledge that somewhere out there the enemy was waiting. They were hidden in tunnels we could not see, watching us from the shadows, planning their next ambush. And soon we would meet them face to face. We marched through the jungle, but the jungle was swallowing us whole. The jungle had been punishing us from the moment we set foot in it, but it was not until the ambushes began that we truly understood what kind of war we were in. One day we were exhausted, soaked, and fighting leeches, and the next we were fighting an enemy that seemed to rise out of the ground itself. It always started with silence. That was the thing about Vietnam. The jungle went quiet before it came alive with fire. Birds stopped chirping, insects hushed, and suddenly you could feel something pressing against your chest, like the air itself had turned heavy. Then the gunfire would erupt. Sharp cracks of AK-47s cut through the mist, and bullets zipped past our ears, snapping branches, tearing leaves apart. You did not see them. You never saw them at first. You only felt the heat of their presence, the invisible eyes watching from the shadows. The first time we were ambushed, it was over in less than a minute, but it felt like hours. 1 second we were trudging down a trail, packs digging into our shoulders, mud sucking at our boots. The next second, men were screaming and hitting the ground. I dove into a ditch, heart hammering in my chest, my rifle clutched so tight my knuckles turned white. My buddy next to me, Johnson, had no time to react. A burst caught him in the chest. He went down with a sound I will never forget, somewhere between a gasp and a sigh. His helmet rolled away into the ferns. I froze. I could not move, could not think. Johnson had been laughing just minutes earlier, joking about the smell of his wet socks. And then, gone. The jungle swallowed him. My stomach turned, my throat closed up, and I tasted bile. This was no exercise, no patrol like we trained for back home. This was real. This was death. The smell hit me next. It is strange how the senses remember. Gunpowder has a sharp, metallic tang that burns the back of your nose. Mix that with the heavy, wet air of the highlands and the iron scent of fresh blood, and you get something that never leaves you. I can still smell it now, decades later. Rain fell through the canopy, carrying smoke and blood into the mud around us, turning the earth into a red swamp. We scrambled to return fire, spraying the tree line, trying to hit shadows. The enemy was hidden, disciplined, invisible. They fired and then disappeared, slipping into tunnels or behind thick roots. We were loud, clumsy, exposed. They were quiet, patient, deadly. That was the first lesson. The North Vietnamese were not like any enemy we had faced before. They were not going to meet us head-on in open battle. They were going to bleed us, one ambush at a time. After the shooting stopped, the silence came back, heavier than before. We counted the dead. We carried Johnson's body on a poncho, his face pale under the rain. No words were spoken. No prayers were said. We just kept moving, each man lost in his own thoughts, the jungle closing around us again. It did not take long before the ambushes became routine. A sudden burst of fire on a trail. A grenade rolling out of nowhere. Tripwires hidden in the grass. At night, flares would light up the sky, and for a few seconds you would see shapes darting in the distance, like shadows playing tricks on your mind. Sleep never came easy after that. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the leaves could be the enemy. I remember one night we set up a perimeter on a ridge. It was pouring rain and most of us were half asleep under our ponchos. Then came the whistle of incoming fire. Mortar shells rained down, tearing through trees, showering us with splinters. The ground shook like an earthquake. Men shouted in the darkness, scrambling for cover. I pressed myself into the mud, heart pounding, ears ringing, the acrid smoke choking my lungs. When it was over, 2 men were dead and several were wounded. The rest of us sat in silence, drenched and shivering, staring into the night. That was when it really sank in. We were in a place where the enemy knew every path, every hill, every shadow. We were strangers in their world, walking blind through their traps. No matter how many patrols we made, no matter how many hills we climbed, it felt like we were always one step behind. And yet we kept moving. We had to. Orders pushed us forward, deeper into the highlands, deeper into the heart of their territory. Every step was heavier now, not just from the mud and the weight of gear, but from the memory of who we had already lost. The war was no longer a rumor in a newspaper. It was no longer a far-off fight on the other side of the globe. It was here, breathing down our necks, staring at us from the trees. I can still see Johnson's face in that moment before he fell. I can still hear the sigh as the life left him. It was the first time I saw a friend die, but it would not be the last. When your buddy goes down beside you, that is when the war becomes real. That is when you understand that this is not about strategy, not about speeches, not about headlines. This is survival. This is the fight to stay alive for one more day, one more night. And that is why I say, with every ounce of memory I have left, when your buddy falls beside you, you finally understand that war is no longer something you read about in the papers. The small ambushes had already shaken us, but nothing prepared us for what happened on Hill 1338 in June of 1967. We called it the Battle of the Slopes, but to those of us who lived through it, it was simply the day hell opened its jaws and tried to swallow us whole. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, was the first to climb that hill. The terrain was brutal, thick canopy above, steep ground below, every step a fight against mud and roots. We thought we were chasing scattered enemy patrols, the same kind of hit-and-run fights we had been facing for weeks. But the truth was far worse. An entire North Vietnamese battalion was waiting for us, dug in, patient, ready. The first shots came mid-morning, a sharp crack from the ridge line, and then all at once the jungle exploded. Machine guns opened up, cutting through the underbrush like chainsaws. Mortars whistled overhead, crashing down with deadly precision. Alpha Company was caught in the open, pinned down before they could even form a proper line. Men dropped instantly, hit before they knew where the fire was coming from. The radio calls came fast and frantic. Voices shouted over static, begging for artillery, for air support, for anything to break the onslaught. But in that thick jungle, the artillery often fell too close, and the canopy blocked the eyes of the pilots above. We were fighting blind against an enemy who had every advantage. I remember the sound more than anything. The constant hammer of AK-47s, the dull thump of grenades, the screams of the wounded. You could hear men crying out for medics, their voices rising and falling until they went quiet. You could hear rifles clicking empty, men cursing as they reloaded, hands shaking in the mud. Sometimes the rifles jammed from the rain and dirt, and panic set in. Nothing is more terrifying than pulling the trigger and hearing only a hollow click when death is charging at you. Alpha Company fought to hold the line, but the North Vietnamese pressed closer, wave after wave. They were relentless, crawling through the grass, flanking from the sides, shouting war cries as they charged. Our men fought back with everything they had. Bayonets were fixed. Rifles turned into clubs. Knives came out, and when nothing else was left, bare fists swung wildly in the chaos. I saw men I had laughed with the night before, men who had been talking about home, now covered in blood, lunging at the enemy with a fury I had never seen. Fear and rage mixed together into something primal. It was not about orders anymore. It was not about politics. It was survival, pure and desperate. We were outnumbered. That became clear quickly. For every enemy soldier we put down, two more seemed to appear from the shadows. They came at us with grenades strapped to their chests, with bayonets gleaming in the rain, with a determination that chilled me to the bone. They did not fear death. They welcomed it as long as they could take one of us with them. By midday, Alpha Company was shattered. Entire platoons had been cut off, isolated, surrounded. The radio chatter grew weaker, more desperate. Reports came in of squads fighting hand to hand, of men refusing to surrender, of soldiers firing until their last round and then charging with knives. The hill was littered with bodies, American, North Vietnamese, tangled together in the mud and the vines. I remember one medic crawling through the open, dragging wounded men back one by one. He was hit twice but kept moving, blood soaking his uniform. When his supplies ran out, he tore strips from his own shirt to bind wounds. He would not stop until a third bullet finally dropped him beside the men he had tried to save. By the end of that day, more than half of Alpha Company was gone. Of the 137 men who had climbed Hill 1338, fewer than 50 walked back down. The rest were dead or wounded, left behind in the jungle. Those of us who survived carried their memory and their silence with us forever. The aftermath of that fight still haunts me. Hill 1338 was no ordinary battlefield. It was a graveyard carved into the earth by fire and blood. The jungle was silent when the shooting stopped, but it was not peace. It was the silence of death, thick and suffocating, hanging over every broken tree and every fallen man. We moved cautiously, stepping over bodies, some of them our friends, some of them the enemy. The air was heavy with smoke, gunpowder, and the unmistakable stench of blood. I can still see the torn uniforms, the shattered helmets, the rifles lying in the mud beside hands that would never grip them again. Some men lay face down, their packs still strapped to their backs as if they had fallen mid-step. Others stared upward, eyes wide open, unblinking, as if they were still waiting for help that never came. Those who survived were not the same men who had marched up that hill. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They spoke in whispers, if at all. Some sat in shock, clutching rifles with trembling hands, unable to let go even after the firing had stopped. Others stared into the distance as if the jungle itself had swallowed their souls. I will never forget the sound of the wounded calling out. Their cries echoed through the trees long after the enemy had withdrawn. "Medic! Over here! Help me!" The words cut deeper than any bullet. We tried to reach them, dragging bodies through mud and vines, but sometimes it was too late. Sometimes the only thing you could do was hold a man's hand as he slipped away, whispering that he was not alone. And then came the reports. The numbers. Out of 137 men in Alpha Company, more than 70 were dead. Nearly every survivor was wounded. A company that had been full of life, laughter, and youth just hours earlier was now reduced to a handful of broken, bleeding men. It felt impossible, unreal, like some kind of nightmare. But it was real. Too real. The Battle of the Slopes was a lesson written in blood. We learned that the North Vietnamese were not just determined fighters, they were masters of their terrain, willing to sacrifice everything to destroy us. They did not fight like any enemy we had ever trained for. They were ghosts, shadows, warriors who refused to yield. And they had nearly wiped out an entire company of American paratroopers in a single day. In the days that followed, the rest of us tried to pick up the pieces. Reinforcements arrived, artillery pounded the hills, helicopters thundered overhead. But nothing could erase what had happened. We buried our dead, wrapped in ponchos, their names read softly as we laid them into the earth. No ceremony, no music, just the rain falling steady on our helmets as we said goodbye. I remember one chaplain standing among us, his voice shaking as he tried to speak. He said, "They gave everything. They did not run. They fought to the last breath." And then he went silent because there were no words left. Nothing anyone could say could match what those men had endured. For me, the image that never leaves is the sight of men fighting long after their rifles had gone empty. I saw bayonets flashing in the rain. I saw knives drawn, fists swinging, boots stomping. I even saw one man, out of ammunition and bleeding badly, grab an enemy soldier with his bare hands and wrestle him into the mud. He did not survive, but he did not go down without a fight. That is something I carry with me always. Because that was the truth of Hill 1338. When the bullets ran dry, when the grenades were gone, when the radios went silent, American soldiers still fought. They fought with knives. They fought with fists. They fought with their last breath. When the bullets ran out, an American soldier still threw himself at the enemy with nothing but his bare hands. The battle ended, but the war did not. We marched on, carrying the ghosts of Alpha Company with us. Every step deeper into the highlands felt heavier, as if the jungle itself was reminding us what it had already taken. We knew now what we were up against. We knew the price. And still, orders pushed us forward, toward battles even more terrible than the one we had just survived. Hill 1338 was only the beginning. After the Battle of the Slopes, we thought the worst might be behind us. We had seen hell on Hill 1338, and surely nothing could be worse than that. But in war, the moment you think you understand the enemy is the moment you are already lost. By October of 1967, we would learn that lesson all over again. Word came down that the North Vietnamese were back, and not just in small patrols or scattered battalions. They had sent their entire 1st Division, more than 6,000 men, into the Central Highlands. 3 regiments up front, another in reserve supported by artillery. It was a force unlike anything we had faced before. We were told our mission was simple: stop them. But nothing about what followed was simple. When we pushed deeper into the hills, we began to see the scale of what they had built. Miles of tunnels, trenches, and bunkers carved into the earth with patience and precision. Some had taken months to prepare, dug by hand in the dark, reinforced with timber, camouflaged with roots and vines until they were invisible. You could walk right past and never know you were standing on top of a fortress. I still remember the first time we stumbled across one of those tunnel systems. At first, it looked like just another patch of jungle floor. Then a tripwire snapped, a grenade went off, and suddenly the ground seemed to open. We found passageways big enough to march through, storage rooms stacked with supplies, even underground hospitals. It felt less like we were fighting soldiers and more like we were fighting the jungle itself, alive and organized against us. That was when the whispers began. Maybe we were the ones being hunted. The officers said we were carrying the fight to the enemy, but among the grunts, it felt different. It felt like we had walked into a trap, step by step, guided by an invisible hand. Every hill we climbed, every clearing we crossed, it was as if they already knew we were coming. When the order came to begin Operation MacArthur, we did what soldiers always do: we followed. The 4th Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne, and others were thrown back into the highlands. We patrolled, we searched, we destroyed what we could. But with every bunker we blew up, it seemed like 3 more were waiting ahead. With every contact, their fire came stronger, sharper, as if they were leading us exactly where they wanted us to be. I can still see the faces of the men around me when we realized just how big the enemy force was. Nobody said it out loud, but you could feel it. The looks in their eyes, the way they tightened their grips on their rifles. We were out there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains and endless green, and somewhere in that jungle, 6,000 men were waiting. It was like walking blind into the mouth of a beast. And the worst part was the uncertainty. We never knew if the next step would set off a mine, if the next ridge would open up with gunfire, if the next village was empty or crawling with NVA. Every sound in the jungle became suspicious. A bird call might be a signal. A snapped branch might mean an ambush. You lived on edge, every nerve stretched thin, every heartbeat reminding you that you were still alive, at least for now. One night, we set up a perimeter near a ridge line. The rain fell steady and the jungle seemed quiet. Too quiet. I lay awake listening. Somewhere in the distance, I swore I could hear voices. The next morning, when we swept the area, we found abandoned fire pits, still warm. They had been watching us. Close. Always close. That was the cruel genius of the enemy. They made us believe we were on the hunt, that we were the predators stalking through the jungle. But the truth revealed itself slowly, painfully, with every step deeper into those mountains. We thought we were the hunters. But in reality we were the prey. Looking back now, I realize that was the most terrifying part. Not the bullets, not the explosions, not even the sight of friends falling beside me. It was the knowledge that we were not in control, that we were playing someone else's game on someone else's ground. The enemy knew where we were going, and how to bleed us until we broke. When Operation MacArthur began, we carried our gear, our rifles, and our fears back into the jungle. We did not know it then, but the battles ahead, at hills with numbers like 823 and 875, would make even the nightmare of Hill 1338 seem like a grim prelude. The storm was gathering and we were already standing in its path. Operation MacArthur had begun, and for us in the 173rd Airborne, the first test came on Hill 823. The order was simple on paper: clear the hill of enemy forces and secure it for a fire support base. But nothing in that jungle was ever simple. We moved out before dawn, the rain falling steady, the air heavy with mist. Every step up that slope felt like we were dragging chains. The jungle wrapped around us, thick and choking, hiding everything. We knew they were up there, waiting. The only question was when the first shot would come. It came fast. Just as the lead elements broke through the treeline near the ridge, machine guns erupted. The hillside exploded with fire, AK-47s, mortars, grenades. The enemy had been dug in, waiting, their bunkers camouflaged so well they seemed to rise out of the earth itself. We hit the ground, firing back, trying to find targets in the chaos. The rain mixed with smoke, turning the air into a gray fog. You could see flashes of muzzle fire but never the men behind them. Every tree seemed alive, every shadow a rifle barrel. The call went up for artillery. Minutes later, the hills shook as beehive rounds ripped through the enemy's lines. Thousands of steel darts hissed through the air, shredding the underbrush and tearing gaps into the bunkers. The sound was like an angry swarm of hornets. Then the jets came, screaming overhead, dropping bombs that lit the jungle with fire. Trees toppled, the earth shook, and for a brief moment, we thought maybe we had broken them. But the North Vietnamese did not break. They clung to that hill with everything they had. As we pushed forward, it turned into close combat. Bunkers had to be cleared one by one. Grenades first, then rifles, then bayonets. I remember charging a trench, the enemy only a few feet away, both of us firing blindly. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat. The screams of the wounded mixed with the blasts of grenades. Men were fighting face to face, sometimes with knives, sometimes with bare hands. By afternoon we had reached the crest. The bodies of the enemy lay scattered among their bunkers and the hill was ours, but at a terrible cost. Dozens of our own men were down, some silent, others groaning for medics who never seemed to come fast enough. When the shooting stopped, the jungle fell quiet again, but the silence was worse than the noise. We walked among the wreckage, stepping over craters, shattered trees and bodies, some ours, some theirs. The smell lingered, heavy and metallic. Death had settled over Hill 823, and we carried it with us long after we left. We barely had time to breathe after Hill 823 before the next order came. Intelligence reported enemy activity on Hill 882, only a few miles away. We were exhausted, soaked, and carrying the weight of our dead, but orders were orders. We shouldered our gear and marched toward another hill, another fight. The climb to 882 was worse than before. The slopes were steep, the ground slick with mud, and the rain never seemed to stop. Leeches clung to our legs, mosquitoes swarmed our faces, and every step was a battle of its own. We knew what waited at the top. By then we all knew. The first contact came when we were halfway up. A burst of AK fire tore through the line, cutting down 2 men in an instant. Then the hillside lit up with gunfire. The North Vietnamese had trenches and bunkers dug deep into the slope, hidden by the jungle canopy. We hit the ground, returning fire, but it felt like the whole hill was alive, spitting bullets and grenades down on us. Air support was called in. Jets screamed overhead, dropping napalm and bombs that shook the ground beneath our boots. The fire roared through the treetops, turning green leaves into black ash. For a moment, the hill seemed to burn. The smell was overwhelming: smoke, chemicals, and something worse: flesh. When the smell of burning flesh mixed with the damp jungle air, I knew I would never forget this place. But even napalm could not kill them all. As we pushed upward, the enemy emerged from hidden trenches, firing point blank. It was chaos: grenades exploding in foxholes, rifles jamming in the mud, men screaming as shrapnel tore through them. We fought through it one bunker at a time, clearing each hole with grenades, rifles, or bayonets. In the madness, the fighting became primal. A man next to me ran out of ammo and drew his knife, leaping into a trench to take on 2 enemy soldiers hand to hand. By nightfall we had reached the top, but it was no victory. The hill was covered in bodies, both theirs and ours. I remember walking through the trenches, stepping over corpses piled 3 deep. The jungle floor was soaked with blood, turning the mud into something unholy. Medics moved among the wounded, their hands shaking, their bandages already gone. Some men lay silent, staring at nothing, their eyes wide open even in death. We had taken the hill, but what we gained was only ground, not peace. No one spoke that night. We dug foxholes on the crest, our rifles clutched tight, our nerves frayed. The jungle smelled of smoke and death. It clung to us, soaked into our skin, into our memories. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see Hill 882. I can hear the silence after the fight, the kind of silence that makes you realize the jungle is not empty. It is watching. Always watching. Hill 882 was supposed to be a step forward in Operation MacArthur, but for us, it was a step deeper into hell. And hell was not done with us yet. After the bloodbath on Hill 882, we thought maybe the worst was behind us. But the Central Highlands had more lessons to teach, and they were written in the blood of men I still see when I close my eyes. One of them was John Barnes. Private First Class John Barnes was just a kid, really. 19 years old, with a smile that reminded you of home. He had a way of lightening the mood, cracking jokes when the rain wouldn't stop, or sharing the last cigarette in his pack when someone needed it most. He wasn't the loudest or the toughest, but he had a kind of quiet strength, the kind you only noticed when everything fell apart. It happened during one of those brutal firefights in November. The jungle exploded around us, AK fire, grenades, mortars. Men shouted, ducking for cover, returning fire where they could. The enemy pressed hard and it felt like we were being swallowed alive. In the chaos, I saw Barnes manning a machine gun, laying down fire to keep them back. He was calm, steady, even as bullets snapped past his head. Then it happened. A grenade landed near the wounded, close enough to kill us all. Time seemed to slow. I remember the metallic clink as it hit the ground, the way every head turned toward it, the sharp intake of breath before the blast. But the blast never came because Barnes moved. Without hesitation, without a second thought, he threw himself onto the grenade. His body absorbed the explosion, sparing the men around him. The sound was muffled, the smoke rising around us. For a moment, no one moved. We just stared. Then the reality hit. He was gone. Just like that. I remember kneeling beside him, my ears ringing, my chest hollow. The men he saved were alive, their faces pale with shock. One whispered, "He saved us." Another just cried, clutching his rifle. None of us knew what to say. How do you put words to something like that? Some officers later argued about it, calling it reckless, even labeling it suicide. But for those of us who were there was no doubt. Barnes had made a choice that saved lives at the cost of his own. That kind of courage doesn't fit neatly into a report or a medal citation. It lives in the hearts of the men who walked away because of him. I've carried him with me every day since. I think about his mother who never saw him come home. I think about the men he saved, men who had wives and children, men who got the chance to live out lives that Barnes never did. And I think about the look on his face in those final seconds. Not fear, not panic, but determination. That's the thing about war. It isn't just about battles and strategies. It's about moments like that when one man makes a choice that changes everything. Barnes didn't just give his life, he gave us ours. And that is something you never forget. He died so that I could live, and that is a debt I will carry for the rest of my life. Not long after Barnes gave his life, another name was etched into my memory forever. Specialist 4th Class Carlos Lozada. If Barnes taught me what it meant to sacrifice without hesitation, Lozada showed me what it meant to fight until the very last breath. Carlos was different from Barnes. He had fire in his eyes, a kind of defiance that made you believe nothing could break him. He loved to talk about New York, about the streets he grew up on, about the girl he wanted to marry when he made it home. He laughed loud, fought hard, and carried himself like a man who had already made peace with danger. But when the moment came, that fire turned into something unforgettable. It was November 1967, Hill 875. The jungle was chaos. Alpha Company had been hit hard, caught in a storm of bullets and explosions. Men were falling fast and the enemy was pressing close. We were ordered to pull back, to regroup before we were surrounded. Retreat in that jungle wasn't easy, you couldn't just turn and run. Someone had to hold the line or no one would make it out alive. That someone was Carlos Lozada. I can still see him setting up behind his M60, his hands steady as he raked the treeline with fire. The enemy poured down the slope, dozens of them shouting, firing, moving to cut us off. Lozada didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger and held it, the barrel glowing, the belt of ammunition feeding through as fast as his gun could spit it out. "Go," he shouted. "Get out of here." We hesitated, no one wanted to leave him. But his fire was the only thing holding back the wave. He knew it. We knew it. And so we moved, crawling, running, dragging the wounded while Lozada kept the enemy at bay. His gun chattered, loud and defiant, drowning out the chaos. Then came the moment I'll never forget. The enemy closed in, grenades bursting, bullets snapping past. Lozada stayed where he was, refusing to fall back, refusing to let them through. Even as the line collapsed around him, even as the enemy swarmed closer, he kept firing. He cut down dozens, maybe more. Each burst bought us precious seconds, each second another life saved. And then, silence. His gun went quiet. We looked back and he was slumped over his weapon, blood staining his uniform. He had given everything, his strength, his breath, his life, to buy us the chance to escape. When we gathered later, the men were silent. Some wept openly. Others just stared at the ground, unable to speak. One soldier said softly, "He stayed so we could go." And that was the truth. Lozada didn't just fight the enemy, he gave us time, he gave us hope, and in the end he gave us our lives. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, but medals don't capture the sound of his voice shouting at us to run, or the way his machine gun sang in the jungle that day. Medals don't capture the weight of knowing that your own life is tied to his death. That he is gone and you are here. Even now, all these years later, I can hear his gunfire echoing in my head. I can feel the shame of running while he stayed. I can feel the gratitude, the sorrow, the debt that never fades. He died so that I could live, and that is a debt I will carry for the rest of my life. Hill 875. Even now, just saying those numbers brings back the taste of mud, blood, and fear. After Hill 823 and 882, we thought we had already seen the worst. But what awaited us on 875 would make everything before feel like a cruel rehearsal for the main act of hell. On November 18, 1967, our orders were clear. Assault Hill 875 and drive the enemy from the summit. The hill was more than just a piece of high ground, it was the key to controlling the valley around Dak 2, and both sides knew it. Intelligence told us the enemy was dug in, but no amount of briefing could have prepared us for what we were about to face. The night before the attack, artillery and air strikes pounded the hill. The earth shook beneath us as napalm turned sections of the jungle into firestorms. Trees snapped, craters opened, and the ridge was scarred black with smoke. Watching from below, we thought nothing could survive that. We were wrong. The next morning, the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, began the climb. The jungle was thick, the slopes steep, the ground a mess of shattered trees and burned stumps. We moved cautiously, rifles ready, eyes scanning the ridgeline. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Then the world exploded. Machine guns opened from hidden bunkers. Mortars rained down from the crest. The hillside came alive with enemy fire, cutting into us from every angle. Men dropped instantly, some without a sound, others screaming as they fell. We dove for cover, but there was little to be found, just splintered trees and churned earth. The enemy had prepared for this, and they had every advantage. The assault slowed to a crawl. We inched forward, only to be driven back by gunfire and grenades. Bunkers were interconnected, tunnels allowing the enemy to pop up where we least expected. You'd clear one only to be hit from the flank a moment later. By mid-afternoon, our companies were pinned. Delta Company tried to advance only to be shredded by crossfire. Charlie Company took a bunker but lost half its men in the process. Alpha Company, set back to prepare a landing zone for resupply, found itself under sudden assault. Specialist Carlos Lozada, God rest his soul, held them off as long as he could. His courage saved lives, but Alpha was mauled. By nightfall we were stuck on the slopes, surrounded, our dead and wounded scattered across the hillside. Resupply was nearly impossible. Helicopters tried to reach us, but the sky filled with tracers and many never made it through. The jungle lit up with streaks of fire as birds fell from the sky, their cargoes of ammo and water exploding uselessly in the brush below. That night was the longest of my life. We dug in on the slope, exhausted, wet and terrified. The cries of the wounded echoed through the darkness. Some had been lying there since the assault began, unable to move, bleeding out slowly while we listened, helpless to reach them. The medics worked tirelessly, but there weren't enough hands, not enough bandages, not enough morphine. I'll never forget one medic, desperate, tearing bandages from the bodies of the dead to wrap around the living. It was grotesque, it was heartbreaking, but it was the only way to keep men alive. Survival had become raw, stripped of dignity. We prayed for morning, for relief, for something to break the nightmare. But deep down we knew Hill 875 was not done with us. The real slaughter was yet to come. Morning broke on November 19th, but the light brought no relief. The sun rose over Hill 875 to reveal a battlefield that looked like something out of a nightmare. Bodies were strewn across the slope, some twisted in death, others groaning in pain, their eyes pleading for help. The smell of blood and smoke hung in the damp air, heavy and suffocating. We were trapped. The enemy had us surrounded, their fire constant and merciless. Every attempt to move forward was shredded by machine guns. Every attempt to pull back was cut short by mortars. We were pinned to the hillside, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Ammunition ran low. Water was nearly gone. Some men tried to catch rain in their helmets, licking the drops like animals. Others rationed their last canteens, passing them from man to man. You could feel the desperation setting in, a slow crawl into the soul. And then there were the wounded. God, the wounded. Some had been lying in the mud since the previous morning, their bandages soaked through, their bodies weak with blood loss. Medics crawled from man to man, but there were too many. They tore open what supplies they had left, and when those ran out, they did the unthinkable. They cut bandages from the dead to wrap the living. I watched a medic unwrap a dressing from a fallen soldier, his hands trembling, and then press it onto the chest of a man still breathing. It was gruesome, it was desperate, but it was the only way. Helicopters tried to break through, hovering low with supplies, but the sky was a death trap. Enemy gunners had the slopes zeroed in. Choppers came in smoking, sometimes bursting into fireballs before they even touched down. We watched one Huey spiral into the treeline, exploding in a roar that shook the ground. The men on board never had a chance. And still the wounded waited. 36 hours, some of them lay there, calling for water, for morphine, for their mothers. 36 hours of agony while the jungle shook with gunfire and artillery. Some begged us to finish them, to put an end to the pain. Others whispered prayers, holding on to whatever hope they could. The cries stayed with us, carved into our minds. We could do nothing but fight and hope the line held. At night, the enemy tested us with probes, firing bursts into the perimeter, tossing grenades into the dark. We fired back blindly, the jungle flashing with muzzle fire, shadows dancing in the mist. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch could be death creeping closer. Sleep was impossible. We sat in our foxholes, fingers locked on our triggers, hearts pounding with the thought that the next second might be our last. By the second day, the line between sanity and madness blurred. Men spoke to themselves, muttered names of loved ones, swore they could hear voices calling from home. Others stared blankly into the distance, their minds somewhere far away. War does that. It doesn't just break bodies, it breaks the mind piece by piece. The siege dragged on. We were clinging to the hillside, bleeding, starving, fighting with whatever strength we had left. And through it all, one thought never left us: we might not make it out of here. That night, as I lay in the mud with my rifle across my chest, listening to the jungle breathing around me, I whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not even for life, just for it to end one way or another. Hill 875 had become a place where hope went to die. November 21st. By then, time had lost its meaning. Hours felt like days, days like weeks. We were ghosts clinging to the mud of Hill 875, our strength slipping away with every passing moment. The dead lay among us, their faces pale and still, while the wounded groaned, waiting for salvation that never seemed to come. The order came: attack again. Reinforcements from the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, had finally arrived, and together we would try to take the summit. None of us had much left to give, but orders were orders. We fixed bayonets, loaded what few magazines we had, and prepared to climb once more into hell. Artillery pounded the hilltop, shaking the earth, ripping apart what was left of the jungle. Airstrikes roared in, dropping bombs that blasted craters into the slope. The ground smoked, trees snapped, and the ridgeline was torn to pieces. When the barrage lifted, we moved. It was a crawl, a struggle more than an advance. Every foot forward was paid in blood. Enemy fire poured down, machine guns raking the slope, mortars exploding among us. We threw grenades, we fired rifles until the barrels steamed, we clawed our way up the ridge like animals fighting for survival. The enemy was dug in deep, trenches layered, bunkers linked by tunnels. You'd clear one position, only to find another just yards away, manned and waiting. They fought with a ferocity that stunned us, refusing to yield even as we closed in. It was bunker-to-bunker combat, grenades and bayonets, fists and knives. I saw men wrestle in the mud, locked in a primal struggle where survival was measured in seconds and inches. By the 22nd we had gained ground, but the cost was staggering. Nearly a third of the battalion was down, dead or wounded. We were hollowed out, fighting on willpower alone. Supplies dropped from the air often fell into enemy hands, the parachutes drifting into the wrong side of the hill. I will never forget the sight of a crate of water and ammunition landing in a North Vietnamese trench, their shouts of triumph echoing through the jungle while we lay dying of thirst. Thanksgiving Day, November 23rd. Reinforcements from the 4th Infantry Division finally reached us, climbing from the valley below. Together we made the last push. The air was thick with smoke, the ground trembling with artillery. The hilltop loomed above us, scarred and blackened, still spitting fire. And then, suddenly, it was over. We reached the summit, only to find the trenches empty. The North Vietnamese had slipped away through their tunnels, leaving behind nothing but bodies, wreckage, and silence. We had taken Hill 875, but there was no triumph, no cheer, no sense of victory. The hilltop was a wasteland, littered with corpses, shattered trees, and broken men. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, clinging to our skin, our uniforms, our memories. That night, instead of celebration, we received a Thanksgiving meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberries. The irony was cruel. We sat in the mud, surrounded by the dead, eating food that tasted like ashes in our mouths. No one spoke. Some men cried silently. Others just stared into the distance, their eyes hollow. When we finally pulled back, only a fraction of us remained untouched. Out of the 173rd Airborne, hundreds were dead, over 1,000 wounded. 40 helicopters had been shot down. Hill 875 had cost more than anyone could have imagined. And yet, when the reports went out, the brass called it a victory. They said we had broken the enemy, driven them back, secured the high ground. But for those of us who were there, victory was just another word. What we had seen on that hill was not triumph, it was slaughter. Even now, decades later, I still see it when I close my eyes. The mud, the smoke, the cries of the wounded. The smell of blood and burning flesh. The endless climb into fire. Hill 875, the place where the living envied the dead. When we finally came down from Hill 875, we weren't the same men who had gone up. The hill had taken everything from us. Our strength, our brothers, our faith. The official reports would later call it a victory, but none of us felt like victors. We felt like survivors crawling out of a grave. The numbers tell one part of the story. In the 3 weeks of fighting around Dak 2, the 173rd Airborne Brigade lost 361 men killed, 1,441 wounded and 15 missing. 40 helicopters were shot out of the sky, their twisted wrecks still littering the jungle. Some of the choppers had been carrying ammunition and water meant for us, supplies that never made it to the hillside where men lay dying. Others carried medevac crews shot down while trying to rescue the wounded. The jungle floor was littered with both metal and bone. The North Vietnamese paid a heavy price as well, between 1,200 and 1,400 men killed. But unlike us, they held the initiative. They fought us to the breaking point and then slipped away, vanishing into the jungle, back to their sanctuaries across the border in Cambodia and Laos. They had not been destroyed. They had not been broken. They had simply bled us, then walked away. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, issued a statement soon after. He called Dak to a great victory, proof that American firepower had crushed the enemy. He insisted that at no time had U.S. troops been surrounded, trapped, or cut off. He said the battle was the beginning of a great defeat for the enemy. We listened to those words and it felt like salt in an open wound. Because we had been surrounded. We had been cut off. We had fought for days with no food, no water, and barely any ammunition. We had listened to our wounded cry out for 36 hours while helicopters burned in the sky above us. We had seen friends die with nothing but a medic's bloody hands trying to hold them together. And when the hill was finally taken, the enemy wasn't there anymore. They had already moved on, preparing for something bigger, something none of us could see coming. The truth is, Dak 2 wasn't a victory. It was a warning. The North Vietnamese had drawn us into the Central Highlands deliberately. They had forced us to commit massive resources, brigades of infantry, air cavalry, artillery, air support, just to hold on to one corner of jungle. And while we bled on those hills, they were already planning the Tet Offensive. In January 1968, just 2 months later, the country would explode. Saigon, Hue Key San, everywhere at once. Tet would shatter whatever illusions remained that the war was being won. It would prove that the enemy we thought we had broken at Dak 2 was stronger than ever, willing to bleed and die until America itself lost the will to fight. But at the time, all we knew was that we had lost too much. I remember sitting at the base of Hill 875, watching the helicopters carry out the wounded, the bags of the dead lined up in rows. I remember thinking, for what? For a hill? For a patch of jungle the enemy didn't even want anymore? That's the cruelty of war. It demands blood for ground that has no meaning. It demands lives for hills that will be abandoned a week later. Some men never came back from Dak 2, at least not in their minds. The nightmares followed them home. The smell of smoke, the screams of the wounded, the sight of friends torn apart, it all came back in the dark hours of the night. Wives and children would never understand why their fathers stared blankly into space or woke up screaming. And those of us who did return carried something heavier than our rucksacks ever were. The weight of knowing our leaders called it victory while we called it survival. Hill 875 wasn't just another battle. It was a turning point, not in the war itself but in us. It was the moment many of us realized the war was not about winning or losing hills. It was about endurance, about politics, about men dying for ground that meant nothing. We won a hill, but we lost our faith in the war. When the helicopters lifted us out of Dak 2, the war did not end. It only changed shape. The jungle was behind us, but it lived on inside of us. You don't leave a place like Hill 875, you carry it home, in your skin, in your bones, in your dreams. I tried to tell myself I was lucky. I had survived when so many had not. Barnes, Lazada, the boys from my platoon who never made it back down the hill, they had given everything. I owed it to them to live, to make something of the life they gave me. But survival has its own cost. The first nights back at base, I would wake up to the sound of gunfire that wasn't there. My hands would shake, reaching for a rifle that wasn't beside me anymore. I could still hear the cries of the wounded, still smell the jungle burning. The worst was the silence. When the noise stopped, when everyone else was sleeping, that's when the memories came rushing back, filling the quiet with screams only I could hear. Back home in America, things were different. People didn't want to hear about Vietnam. Some cursed us, called us killers. Others pretended the war didn't exist. The welcome home was not parades and flags. It was silence, awkward stares, sometimes even hate. So we learned to keep quiet. We locked our memories away, burying them as deep as we could. But the locks never held. Some of the men turned to the bottle. Others to pills. Some never found their way back at all, their lives unraveling in slow motion. Families were torn apart by the war years after the bullets stopped flying. Children grew up wondering why their fathers were angry, distant, broken. Wives carried the weight of battles they had never seen. And yet, amid the darkness, there were moments of light. Veterans found each other. We sat in bars, at reunions, or sometimes just on a porch, sharing a smoke, talking about the jungle no one else understood. Only with them could I say the names, describe the sights, let the memories breathe without judgment. Among brothers, the silence was lifted. Still, the war lingers. To this day, a sudden sound, a car backfiring, fireworks on the 4th of July, can drag me back to that hillside. I see Barnes throwing himself on that grenade. I see Lazada firing his machine gun until the end. I see the hill littered with the bodies of men who will never come home. That is the legacy of Vietnam, not just the numbers, not just the politics, but the ghosts that live with us, the battles that never truly end. The war took their lives, but it also took pieces of ours, leaving us to fight battles no one else can see. As the years passed, I began to realize that Vietnam wasn't just a chapter in my life. It was a mark on my soul, one that time could not erase. Some wounds fade, some scars soften, but others remain raw no matter how many decades slip by. Hill 875 is one of those wounds. We often gather at reunions, gray-haired men now, our bodies slower, our voices softer. We talk about the old days, about the friends we lost, about the weight we still carry. Sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, sometimes we just sit in silence, each of us remembering in our own way. For a moment, we are young again, back in the jungle, sweating under 100 pounds of gear, listening for the enemy in the rustling leaves. People ask me what I think about the war now, after all this time. Was it worth it? Did we win? I never know how to answer. We fought bravely, that much I know. We gave everything we had. But victory? No. Vietnam taught me that in war, winning and losing are not measured in hills taken or enemies killed. They are measured in lives broken, in dreams cut short, in the shadows that follow a man home. And yet, I hold on to something else, something deeper. In that jungle, in the mud and blood, I saw the best of men. I saw courage that defied reason, sacrifice that words can never capture. Barnes giving his life for wounded brothers. Lazada holding the line so we could escape. Countless others who stood their ground when fear should have broken them. Those moments, those men, that is the legacy I choose to keep. Vietnam is part of America's history, but for us who were there, it is more than history. It is memory, it is pain, it is love, it is loss. It is the faces of young men who never grew old, frozen in time, forever 19 or 20, forever standing beside us in the jungle. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see the green of the canopy, still feel the rain soaking my uniform, still hear the crack of rifle fire. But I also hear laughter, guys passing a cigarette, telling stories about home, dreaming of a world beyond the war. Those memories are precious, reminders that even in hell, humanity survived. The war may have ended long ago, but for us, it lives on. We tell these stories not for glory, not for pity, but so that the sacrifices are not forgotten. So that the names of our brothers live, carried forward in every word, every memory, every tear. Because in the end, that is what remains, Not the hills, not the battles, but the men who fought them, and the love we still hold for each other. When I look back now, more than half a century later, I often wonder what we were really fighting for. The war was painted for us in colors of duty, freedom, and honor. But when you are 19 years old, carrying a rifle through a jungle, you are not thinking about politics. You are thinking about surviving the day. You are thinking about your buddies. You are thinking about home. War strips away all the slogans. It shows you the raw truth, that in the end you fight not for flags or speeches but for the man next to you, for the brother in the mud beside you, for the one who would give his life so you can keep yours. To the younger generation I say this: never forget that freedom, however you define it, has been paid for in blood. But also never forget the cost. War is not glory. War is not parades and medals. War is screams in the night, bodies on the ground, the sound of mothers crying for sons who will never come home. I hope that my story and the stories of my brothers serve not to glorify the war but to remind you of its price. Remember Barnes, who threw himself on a grenade so others could live. Remember Lozada, who stood his ground until his last breath. Remember the countless names etched into black stone on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, each one a young life cut short. If there is one lesson I want to leave behind, it is this: do not waste the life they gave you. Live fully, love deeply, and cherish every day. Because for so many of us, tomorrow never came. And for those who served, who made it home but still carry the war inside, know that you are not alone. Your story matters. Your pain matters. Speak it, share it, let the world know what it cost. Because silence buries the truth, but words keep it alive. I tell these memories not because they are easy but because they must be told. The jungles of Vietnam, the battles of Dak to Hill 875, they are all part of who I am. But more than that, they are part of who we are as a nation. They remind us that courage exists even in the darkest places, that sacrifice can be greater than fear, and that brotherhood can outlast death itself. So if you are listening to this, if you have walked with me through these memories, I ask you for one thing: carry them forward. Tell others. Share the stories. Keep the names alive. That is how we honor the fallen, not with silence but with remembrance. And if you want to walk further with us, through more stories, more memories, more truths about what it meant to fight in Vietnam, then join our journey. Subscribe to this channel, share it with others, and keep the flame alive. Every story told is another step in making sure the men we lost are never forgotten. Because in the end, remembrance is the only victory we can claim.